Welcome to Cycle 2 of Investigating Science, Module 7 and 8. First, we're going to start with our Do Now. We're going to start with this picture here and the quote on our right-hand side. So it says, observing the rule of law means that no one is above the law. So I want you to look at, in what context is the word law being used in this sentence? Does this align with the picture? And does this align with the scientific use of the word law? So pause the video now and complete that activity. So hopefully what you've come up with is a way that the word law is being used in this quote and in this related diagram is not the same way that a scientist would use the word law. And it brings into discussion, I guess, how we actually use those terms in reporting. So our inquiry question for this cycle is reading between the lines. How does the reporting of science influence the general public's understanding of the subject? And we're looking at some terminology. We're looking at the difference in reporting between journal articles and popular media. And then we're looking at some conflict of interest articles and how these are misinterpreted, misrepresented, or suppressed in the media. So our learning intention is to analyse how conflicts of interest can result in scientific evidence being suppressed, misinterpreted, or misrepresented in popular media in comparison to peer-reviewed scientific articles. And again, in this video, we have 6 tasks that relate to our success criteria, and this cycle will take us 2 weeks. So when we talk about reading between the lines, we're talking about the need for science communication to be relevant and available to the general public, but also not in a way that, I guess, downplays the scientific language that is needed to understand the article. So the public does need to be informed of and literate in the process of science, because scientific research is used to inform public policy. And scientific research papers about issues that may impact the wider society often need to be translated for the public before they can actually consume that article and take in that information. So media outlets and journalists usually do this translation. But I guess the question is, what is the intended purpose of the article that they're trying to create? Are they in fact translating it into a way that is looking at, I guess, the data as a whole? Or is it narrowing down what we want the public to look at for our own personal, I guess, or political, economic, or societal gain? So innate bias is the tendency for an individual to draw a flawed inference because of the assumptions and experiences that have influenced them, and therefore due to the mental shortcuts the brain makes when they're making an observation. So issues that are subject to debate in the public sphere, but not the scientific community, include things like climate change, vaccinations, fossil fuels, and alternative energy sources. So scientists know what the information is, but in fact, the general public still have this as a debate, looking at there are in fact 2 sides to the story and looking at interpreting the data in 2 different ways, where scientists would make the one, I guess, inference from the information. So looking at terminology in reports versus articles. So obviously science has its own specific terminology, and there can be problems when this is translated into common and everyday language. And that's because the common language is fluid. It changes through generations and in different contexts. And scientific language is much more static. So the terms are reinforced over time to maintain consistency and therefore only really have one meaning. So we're looking at scientists looking at the background information, supporting details, and results conclusion, whereas the public are looking at it in a different perspective here. So the way in which we use these scientific terms is a little bit different to the common language definition. So a theory is an explanation of why phenomena happen, whereas a theory is a proposed explanation whose status is subject to debate and verification. Hypothesis, an explanation of a concept that is tested scientifically, whereas common language, it's an explanation put forward as the basis of an argument. A belief is a mechanism through which scientists understand the world, but common language is a faith-based belief system where there's no empirical evidence, whereas a scientific belief there does require empirical evidence. And a law is a description usually expressed as a mathematical relationship of what happens in a phenomenon under given conditions, where in common language, it's the regulations that must be complied with, set down by an authoritative body, which we looked at in our Do Now. So our first task is to look at the 5 different articles there and to see if you can look at and find the theory, law, belief, or hypothesis in these articles. So what is the sentence that the word is used in? What does the word mean in the sentence? What is the scientific definition of the word? And therefore, has the word been used correctly in the sentence? And it actually tells you what word you're looking for in those 5 articles. And task 2 here is looking at popular media and looking at reports versus article. And in this activity, we're looking at playing the climate game. So climate change impacts resilience and adaptation in the climate-dependent sports sector, which is in fact the peer-reviewed article. And then we're looking at the, public game, set, match, calling time and climate in action, which is more of a public article for people to read rather than the peer-reviewed journal article there. So we're looking at completing this table to compare both of these articles and see, even though they're on the same topic, but they were developed for different audiences, what impact does that have on the information that is presented? We then move on to conflicts of interest. So a conflict of interest is a situation in which a person or organization is involved in multiple interests, financial or otherwise, and serving one interest could involve working against another. So usually this relates to situations where there's personal interest or whether this might adversely affect a duty owed to make decisions for the benefit of a third party. So a conflict of interest may result in evidence being misused. So it could be suppressed, so prevented from being spread to others. It can be misinterpreted, so not being understood correctly, or it can be misrepresented, so being given a false or misleading account. So the first we're going to look at is the tobacco industry and lung cancer. So in 1950s, there was an independent scientific research that established a link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. Their own research had confirmed the presence of carcinogens in cigarette smoke, so their own being cigarette companies, and established a causal link between smoking and lung cancer. However, cigarette companies then embarked on a campaign of denial and misinformation, which then moved into finally in the 1960s, the tobacco industry put health warnings on their products to negate any possible legal action from those who developed lung cancer after smoking cigarettes. So this has resulted in legislation today having all of these warnings, but the tobacco industry is still quite, being quite difficult in the way that they misrepresent and in this case suppress some of the data that their own research had that in fact lung cancer is developed in people as a result of smoking. So in this task here, you're going to watch the video and look at the HSC question that's there. So in 2019, the question was discuss 2 types of misuse of scientific evidence by the tobacco industry in relation to lung cancer and support your example of each type of misuse. So you want to look at what they were doing with the information and whether they were in fact suppressing it, misinterpreting it, or misrepresenting that in the mainstream media.
These guys realized quick if they were going to claim.
The next is the fossil fuel industry and climate change. So by the early 1970s, climate scientists were beginning to research a consensus that the burning of fossil fuels by humans and the subsequent release of CO2 and other greenhouse gases was causing global temperatures to rise and the climate to shift. So Exxon, which is now called ExxonMobil, suppressed a series of internal documents that showed their own climate scientists had warned Exxon's management committee as early as 1977 that there is general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide released from the burning of fossil fuels. So what they actually, and we see up in the graphic on the top right-hand side, so they used $1 million to support an industry-driven US proposal for the Americans for carbon dividends. So they look like on the outside they were actually supporting the idea that climate change was happening, but they actually spent $100 million on opposing any binding climate regulations and promoting any fossil fuel energy policy. So we can see here that not just suppressing the documentation, but also then, working on both sides, so that conflict of interest, that showing on one side that they were supporting it, when really that hundreds of millions of dollars were being spent on actually, I guess, suppressing, I guess, misinterpreting that information that climate change wasn't happening. So in this case, we're going to participate in a climate change debate. So we'll each take a few different roles and answer these questions through our climate change issues. The next is pesticide use and risk. So DDT, a chemical, is developed in 1939 and what is in fact used in the war to control typhus-carrying lice and insects. So its creator, Paul Herman Muller, was awarded the Nobel Prize. However, the use of DDT quickly resulted in insecticide resistance and serious health effects in humans and the environment. And this was first documented in Silent Spring, which was released by Rachel Carson. And I guess instead of supporting the account, the pesticide industry attacked Carson's credibility. So even though she was a scientist, they attacked her credibility and pretty much said that she, wasn't qualified to make such a judgment. So it wasn't until 1987 that it was banned by use in Australia. And it's still used as a means to control mosquito-borne malaria, despite the effectiveness of other approaches and techniques that could be used instead. So in this case, we're looking at really, misinterpreting that information and trying to attack Rachel Carson for her scientific evidence that she had to say that it was dangerous. And the World Health Organization also supports Rachel's stance. But again, there are still lobby groups that say that it isn't dangerous and it should still be used as part of an insecticide use. So in this case, we're going to look at the EPA's topic on DDT, and we're going to deconstruct their article and see if we can, in fact, look at the information that's presented there and see if they are suppressing, misinterpreting, or misrepresenting the information about DDT and its impact on the population. And then the final conflict of interest that we're looking at here is asbestos mining and lung cancer. So asbestos is a naturally occurring fibrous crystal mineral that is strong and extremely heat resistant. So it was used in a lot of buildings as insulation. So in 1899, some concerns were raised about some negative health effects that was being noticed in miners of this material. And it wasn't until 1943 that there was a confirmation of the link between asbestos dust and lung cancer. However, the report was suppressed as death continues to rise. So it wasn't until 1984 that Australia then banned asbestos mining, as well as the manufacture, import, and installation of asbestos as building materials. And in 2003, there was an Australia-wide ban on the manufacture and use of all asbestos products. It was in 2012 that the High Court found the directors, James Hardie, guilty of permitting the release of misleading statements to the stock exchange in relation to victim compensation for asbestos-related diseases. So, in fact, there was a big lawsuit trying to get some compensation for people who suffered lung cancer as a result of asbestos and not being informed of the risk when they were building. And so we're going to be looking at this article here in Task 6. So James Hardie stopped funding asbestos research the moment it could, about how there was a time when they were supporting the compensation claims, but then when that the legal requirement of that ran out, that James Hardie in fact stopped supporting that foundation to support people. So looking at, they did suppress the original information about the link between asbestos and lung cancer, but then also, misrepresenting themselves in the media, that they were doing the right thing and supporting victims when in fact they weren't actually. So that concludes our cycle 2 of our inquiry question, how does the reporting of science influence the general public's understanding of the subject? Remember to complete the Google form and your inquiry question log to prepare yourself for your upcoming trial exams.